I would venture to say that all of you at one time or another have had problems with insurance. It happens to everybody. It's complicated. It's technical. It feels like that insurance companies are only out to make money and never pay claims. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about construction insurance for general contractors. My name is Steve Smith. I'm a licensed North Carolina general contractor. But more importantly, I've been in the insurance industry for over 30 years, and I've worked with all types of builders from small custom builders to large general contractors in the commercial arena. Most of you probably remember when you started your business and you didn't know exactly what type of insurance to buy, or you figured out how to get the bank accounts open and you knew you were going to build something, and so you hired some folks to help you. But the insurance is a tough one because there's no real manual or nobody to really tell you other than go to an agent who may or may not know what they're doing. But it's tough when you first start because there's so many things that you're trying to do, and insurance is probably one of the further down the list. And so a lot of contractors get in the business, and insurance tends to be one of those afterthoughts. What I want to do today, even if you've been in the business for 30 years or 20 years or 10 minutes, I want to try to give you a really broad overview of the types of insurance that are important and the things that you need to be looking at, some of the pitfalls that you need to be aware of, and hopefully by the end of the session, you'll walk away having a better sense of what's important from an insurance standpoint and a risk management standpoint for your construction business. As we begin the session, I want to point out that there are about 6 different major topics or major types of coverage we're going to cover today, but there are an endless number of insurance types out there. And so I've picked the 6 that I find most common in the construction industry for general contractors. And so those 6 types will be builder's risk insurance, property, tools, and equipment, commercial general liability insurance, workers' compensation insurance, commercial auto insurance, umbrella liability, and lastly, we'll cover just a little bit about bonds. These are going to be the main topics we're going to cover, and some of them will take a little longer than others. We're going to spend a good bit of time on general liability. I think that and workers' compensation is probably 2 of the more important and complicated ones, so we will talk a little bit more in depth on those. The first type of insurance we're going to cover is builder's risk insurance. And so builder's risk insurance provides coverage for physical loss to buildings, materials, fixtures, and equipment while under construction. So you're a general contractor. You're going to build a new home for your client, and obviously you're going to get started by grading the project, and at some point you're going to go vertical. During the construction process, all kinds of things can happen to this building, to this home. You could have a tornado come through and tear it down while it's in the framing stages. You could have a fire when you're 80% complete with the house. And so the builder's risk insurance, understand that it is there to protect that physical structure typically while it's under construction. And so that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to buy a builder's risk policy. You'll hear it referred to as that quite a bit. They mention materials, fixture, equipment. So while you're building that house, it's not unusual that you're going to have materials delivered to the job site. A good builder's risk policy will cover those materials, because a lot of times you might have a whole bunch of framing lumber sitting there for 2 weeks before you're ready for it. Now, typically you try to buy that stuff and have it shipped to you, drop shipped as you need it, so that you don't run a lot of risk of it sitting there and somebody stealing it. But the policies will cover the materials and the fixtures, because sometimes fixtures may sit there and not be ready to be installed. I've seen many times where a house is almost finished, they're ready to put the lighting fixtures in. You got $50,000 worth of lighting fixture, and maybe it's something where they bring it a little early and it ends up sitting in the garage. Somebody comes in there, vandalizes it, or steals it. You need to make sure your builder's risk is going to cover that. Very important. So what type of projects can be covered under the builder's risk policy? So there's new construction, which is typical. Uh, Several of you probably do new construction. In addition to new construction, there's remodeling. And I know a lot of you probably do that as well. And it's just, again, very important that you make the distinction when you're buying these builder's risk between the two types of policies. I'll get into a little more about why that's important as we go through this segment. The next thing is, who buys the coverage? Does the contractor buy the coverage or does the owner buy the coverage? This is one of my pet peeves, and I preach to my clients about this a lot, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about this in just a minute. Now, there are two types of policies we see for builder's risk. The first we would call a one-shot or a per project type of policy, and the second would be a reporting form. So basically, just like it sounds, you're building a house, you buy a policy for that house. You're doing a project, you buy a policy for that project. We'll talk a little bit more about that and get into a little more detail about the one shot versus the reporting form just a little bit later. As I mentioned just a minute ago about the different types of projects for builder's risk, you've got your new construction, and then I mentioned that you had remodeling. So I want to talk just a minute about new construction and the builder's risk. It is the most typical kind of coverage. Sometimes it's called ground up coverage. I hear people say when you go vertical is when you want to start. Very important. Coverage must start at the beginning of the project. So you need to make sure that you put this in place. Call your agent, buy the policy. I like to do it. I like to tell my builders, do it early. Do it a little early so you don't forget to do it. Because you'd be amazed how many people call me and they're 60% complete on a house, and they call and say, I forgot to put coverage on that house. Insurance companies do not like that. They do not like to insure a project halfway through the project. It doesn't mean you can't get it done, but it's very difficult. You better have a pretty solid relationship with the carrier and the agent. The point is, do it at the beginning, you'll be much better off. The amount of coverage. So the amount of coverage is important. And when you are telling your agent, I'm building a $500,000 house, okay, we don't want to include the land. We don't want to include, say, the foundation. What we're interested in is the actual total cost of the project mainly minus the land, okay? So if it's a $500,000 project and the owner supplying the land, so your contract price of $500,000, my recommendation would be to insure it at $500,000. That would be your best bet. Then there's no issues, and you have the right amount of coverage. Most of the policies have a co-insurance requirement. I want to make sure you understand how important that is. It goes back to the amount of coverage. If you are required, which they all do, they require you to insure that house at 100% of the replacement cost, which basically is when it's completed. So what does it cost to build it when it's completed, the total project? If you, for example, were to say, you know what, I'm just going to insure it at 75%. Of what it's really going to cost, or you don't insure it at 100%, and you have a loss during the policy period, they will penalize you a percentage based on how much you underinsured that project. So it applies to a partial loss, and quite frankly, you could have a situation where half the building burned and the other half didn't, and it was a $100,000 loss on a $200,000 building, and you were 25% underinsured. They're going to take what you did insure it for and divide it by what you should have insured it for, and they're going to penalize you by that amount, that percentage. So it can be very costly. Make sure you insure it properly. Give it the full amount of the contract. The second type of builder's risk project would be a remodeling project, and there's probably quite a few of you who either have done remodeling or do that exclusively or do both. Builder's risk is a little different when you are doing remodeling, and you have to be very careful with this as well. You can include the existing structure on the policy, or you can exclude the existing structure. So let me give you an example. Your client has a house and they contract with you to build an addition on that house. So most of the time the homeowner has homeowner's insurance on the house. And What you will probably do in that case is you would probably insure the addition for builder's risk. And let's say the addition's $50,000. So you would buy a builder's risk policy, a remodeling form, and then it would be for $50,000. And so it would pay if something happened to that part of the new house that you're building during the construction process. If something happens and the entire thing is destroyed, the homeowner's policy obviously is going to take care of the house, but not the new part. You're going to do that under the builder's risk. Now, let me change gears a minute and let's go to a different example. And here's an example where you're a commercial general contractor and you're going to remodel, let's just say you're going to remodel a school. So you bid a project and the project is to add a big addition to a school, and the contract states that you're responsible to insure the existing structure as well as the new structure. So you got to be really careful with these, and you got to make sure you read the contract very carefully, especially in the commercial world, to make sure you understand what you have to insure. A lot of times you can get your agent to help with that, your attorney to help with that. But if it says you are to insure the existing structure, you would buy still a remodeling form of builder's risk, but you would include the existing structure. Now, the way they do that, the existing structure is only going to be covered for actual cash value. Real important that you understand that concept. Actual cash value is the depreciated value. So you got an old school you're remodeling and you're adding a new addition. The new addition is covered at replacement cost. It doesn't have any depreciation, it's brand new. But that existing structure, if something happens to it, they're only going to pay a depreciated value. So if it's 50 years old, you need to be real careful how much coverage you put on it, because they're only going to pay the depreciated value. And that's something your agent can help you figure out. Lastly on that, I just want to say, if you have the opportunity to not insure the existing structure, I would recommend that you don't. In other words, because it's a depreciated value, if let's say that homeowner has that homeowner's insurance at replacement cost, that's a much better way to insure that existing building. In addition, if you were on a commercial site and let's say the building could be insured by the owner during construction, the existing building, and his policy is probably at replacement cost, you'd be much better off letting the owner insure the existing building and you insure the builder's risk on the new addition. Just a tip, but that's something that I would recommend strongly if you have that option. Okay, so now let's talk about who buys the coverage. So it's typical for the general contractor to buy the coverage. There's several reasons why. Obviously, the general contractor knows what he's building. He knows what the costs are. He knows what the profit is. He knows what the overhead is. He understands what the actual exposures are. So for those reasons, I think it makes sense for the general contractor to buy the coverage. Second reason would be, let me just give you an example. The general contractor is building a house and he's got $500,000 tied up in the house. You're almost finished with construction. There's a tornado comes through and destroys the house. Keep in mind, at this point in the construction, you have invested a tremendous amount of time and energy and resources in this project. Your profit is at risk in this project if it is not properly insured. So if the GC buys the policy, he is the first named insured on the policy. And the reason that's important is at claim time, you're going to get to negotiate with the insurance company, not the owner. Let's say that the owner bought that policy. He's upset with you for whatever reason, and that never happens in our world. But the owner's upset with you, and his relationship is not good, and so now all of a sudden there's a claim. The house is burned down. He's pointing fingers. You're pointing fingers. Well, guess what? He has the money. He's got the control of that claim check. So you're going to have to fight with him about that. So if you are the named insured, you have control at claim time, and I always recommend to my general contractor clients that is a much better thing for you to do, is to buy that policy and control that. Let's move along to types of policies for builder's risk. As I said earlier, you've got the one shot and the per project type policy, which is the most typical type. Most builders are building a house at a time, or maybe two or three at a time. This is just the easiest way to do it. It's the most tracking is easier, costing is easier. It's just a really good way to do it. And if you're not building a whole lot of houses at a time, it's probably the best way to do it. And so I do want you to understand a little bit more about these one-shot policies. The most important thing to remember is you have to start it at the beginning of the project. So don't forget, this thing has to, before you go vertical, you need to call that agent, buy that policy, and put it in place. Another thing to remember about these policies is they are not typically cancelable during the policy period. Normally they are fully earned 12-month policies. They go for 1 year. And if for some reason you're building a big house and it ends up taking you longer than a year to build it, most companies will allow you to renew that, and some companies will even let you prorate the second year in case you sell the house or you finally finish it in a couple months after the first period. Now let's talk about reporting form. The reporting form was designed for builders that are building more homes. So examples of builders that may be using a reporting form, maybe a builder who's doing 20 houses a year or 50 or 100 houses a year. The reporting form gets issued on an annual basis, very similar to the one-shot policy. However, the reporting form puts a limit, an aggregate limit, and let's say that might be who knows, $10 million. I mean, it depends on the size of the builder. But the way it works is you report monthly on the homes that you have under construction. So if you start a house in August, you would report it at the end of August when you do your report for August. So you're reporting in arrears, and you report that house started sometime in August. In September, obviously you're still building that house, so you're going to get another report at the end of September. You're going to report that house plus any other houses you started in that month. So you could conceivably have 10, 15, 20, 100 houses at varying stages in the process, but as long as you're under construction and you report monthly each house that is at risk or under construction, and you pay a premium for each house on a monthly basis on that report, then you have coverage. And it's a really great thing for large builders because as long as they're reporting, they ought to have automatic coverage. And so it's a good policy, and it's really good when you're doing lots of houses. I will caution you, you do have to have a good administrative person or somebody to keep up with it, because you gotta make sure you report, because the last thing you want to do is have a house that's not on the report and there ends up being a problem because somebody didn't put it on there. So anyway, that's a little bit about reporting form versus the one shot, and just depends on the type of company you are and how large you are as to which one you'll choose. So the last thing I want to say about the builder's risk to end this session is there is a clause in all of the builder's risk policies that you need to be familiar with and understand, and it is the when coverage begins and when coverage ends. It's really important because a lot of people don't understand that there's language in the policy that could bite you if you don't understand when the coverage ends. When the coverage begins is easy. It's when you bind the coverage and put the policy in place. But most of these policies will say something to the effect of coverage will end at the earliest of, and then it's going to give several different things that could cause a trigger that could trigger coverage to end. It may say when it is put into its intended use. It may say something like when it is occupied, or it may say when other insurance is placed on the building. Either way, you could have a situation where when it is put into its intended use, well, how many times do you build a building, especially a commercial building, and the owner moves some stuff in? And it's ambiguous as to whether or not that's going to cause coverage to cease or to end. And let's say it does, and you have no coverage on the building, and the owner hadn't put coverage on the building, and something happens to it. So I recommend that you have a conversation with your agent to understand exactly when coverage ends in your builder's risk policies. In the next section, we're going to talk about property tools and mobile equipment. These are all things that some contractors will need coverage for, but not all contractors. If you have an office, you may actually have it in a building that you own or rent. And so in those cases, you may have to buy building insurance for the building if you own it, or you may just have to insure your contents on the inside of the building. And we refer to that as business personal property. And that would include things like your inventory, materials, office furnishings, computers, desks, etc. Sometimes you like to think of it in terms of if you took the building and picked it up, turned it upside down and shook it, if it falls out of the building, then it's a business personal property is one way to think about that. So do have a building you own. Obviously, you're going to have coverage for that, and then the business personal property. And it's always important as well. These are things that are at your location. So you have an office, maybe you've got a warehouse in the back of the office, and you store materials, etc. So just remember that you may have that need in that case. What we see a little bit more regularly is the need for tools and mobile equipment. So from a tool standpoint, they typically fall into two categories. I tell contractors if you have lots of small tools, each tool typically less than $1,000, most of the companies sell policies or build in their policy you can buy what they call blanket coverage for small tools, and you may be able to get 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever you have. And the main thing to remember there is if you've got 6 trucks on the road and they're panel vans and each one has $10,000 worth of tools, $10,000 is not the limit you need to buy. You need to buy 10,000 times 6 or 7 vans, whatever that is. That would be the limit you would purchase. And the reason that is the policy has co-insurance penalties if you underinsure the tools. And you're going to hear that co-insurance term mentioned a lot, but it is a way the insurance company makes sure that you're paying for the premium that they're receiving the premium for the proper exposure. So that's how the small tools would work. On the larger tools, I typically say if you have something worth more than $1,000 or $2,000, you probably will schedule that piece. I know grading contractors have transits and things that can get fairly expensive, lasers, that type stuff. So if it's bigger than or more expensive than $1,000, you would probably schedule it, which just means a schedule of those things listing the make, model, serial number, and a value. In addition to tools, there's mobile equipment. As general contractors, we don't typically have a lot of mobile equipment, heavy equipment, but it is possible. Some general contractors self-perform grading and that type of thing. So if you've got skid steers, excavators, bulldozers, any of those kinds of things, heavier equipment, you would want to have a policy to cover that equipment. And the nice thing about the tools and the mobile equipment, you will sometimes hear these things referred to as inland marine. Basically just means it's not on water, but it's movable and it moves from place to place. And so those types of things are covered that way, so that if it's on a job site, it's covered. If it's in the back of your truck, it's covered. Or if it's at the office, it could also be covered. So regardless where it is, it would have coverage for all the perils, the fires, the theft, and those types of things. A couple things to remember when you're dealing with mobile equipment. Normally, the policy will request a value for that equipment, especially the heavy equipment. Remember to check that on an annual basis, because if you've got a bulldozer you bought 10 years ago, it's not worth near that now, and you may want to reduce the value of that because you're paying premium based on that value. Lastly, when you are dealing with property and equipment, especially the tools and equipment, just be aware that some of the policies at claim time, some of these policies can be a little bit tough. I know I've seen some that have language in them that says if the tools are not under lock and key, or if they're in an unlocked vehicle, they will deny coverage. So if you're a contractor and you've got a van and you've got a lot of tools in there and you don't lock the door or you don't lock your toolbox and you go into Lowe's and come out and those tools are gone, some of the policies will deny those claims. And so you should probably try to make yourself familiar with that, because I have seen that be an issue. So this next segment is near and dear to my heart and probably my favorite part of insurance, and that's the commercial general liability insurance. As a general contractor, this is probably the most misunderstood and difficult coverage for most contractors, and for many, many reasons. And so, what we want to accomplish in this section is to try to give you some basics about commercial general liability and to understand what it will and won't do, and also how that ties back to a lot of the other coverages, the other policies that general contractors need. It's almost like a spoke and a wheel, and I almost see the general liability as the center of the wheel, and then there's quite a few other things that come out from that, whether that be workers' comp, auto, whatever, builder's risk, etc. So we're going to cover the concept of liability. We're going to talk about why is it important. We're going to talk about what is covered and what is excluded. We're going to get into coverage limits and what adequate limits may look like. And then we're going to talk about risk transfer and what that means in the overall operation of your business. And then we're also going to touch on audits just briefly. Even though audits could be a complete 8-hour seminar, we will touch on audits because I know all of you love audits. Concept of liability. You'll hear it in our world, you'll hear it called GL, CGL. I've even heard it called public liability. Some policies refer to it as that. But for our purposes, we're going to call it the CGL, which is a commercial general liability policy, or some people could call it contractors general liability. So general liability covers you for claims involving three main coverages: bodily injury, property damage, personal or advertising injury, and lastly, medical payments resulting from your products, your services, or your operations. So what I want you to kind of key in on is two of those mainly, and that's bodily injury and property damage. Okay, because those are very key. So keywords: bodily injury, property damage. These are the only things covered by general liability. People think general liability covers everything under the sun, and that's not the case. The things I mentioned first: bodily injury, property damage, personal and advertising injury, and medical payments. Those are the only things covered in this policy. And the only two you're probably ever going to deal with in reality are going to be bodily injury and property damage. The medical payments is the only one that does not require negligence or fault in order to be paid out. Okay. Now, one of the key words you need to think about also, whenever you're dealing with liability, you have to understand the word negligence. And so negligence is the failure to exercise the care that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in like circumstances. So carelessness, lack of care, dereliction of duty, non-performance of duty, all of those things are in the definition of negligence. So why is negligence important? It's important because you have to be found negligent in order to be found liable. And if you're not negligent, then you're not liable. It's a really key concept to liability insurance, and every claim situation comes back to, was there negligence? And so that's something that I want you to make sure that you burn that in your brain, because that's a big part of this entire discussion. So why is carrying CGL important? Why is that general liability so important? As a builder and a business owner, it is highly important that you have this coverage. It really is the foundation. You are building a product that you are putting out there for the public. So the commercial general liability is there to protect you as an owner of your company personally, as well as the company. Because some people operate as sole proprietors, not many anymore, but there are some, and they desperately need this coverage. And then most of us operate as LLCs or corporations, and the CGL policy obviously is there to protect that asset. If you think about your company has been building houses for 20 years. There's value in that company and its reputation and its ability to go out and make revenue by building homes. So we protect ourselves through this CGL policy. Next, we protect our clients and the public. These policies are designed so that we're not only protecting ourselves, but we're protecting our clients. And in the public, in the way we're protecting the public is somebody comes on your job site and gets hurt because of your negligence. Well, the CGL policy is there to respond to that. So we're protecting our clients as well as the public. And then lastly, it shows responsibility and credibility for your company. And if you're going to be a well thought of business owner in your community, it's the responsible thing to do to have the right coverage so that when something bad happens, that there are resources there to help take care of those things. So bad things happen to good people, and we all know that. And sometimes we could have the best intentions, but mistakes get made and there are injuries, whether they're bodily injuries or sometimes to property damage. So there'll be property damage. So those are the main reasons why we carry the CGL coverage. So now to the good stuff. What is actually covered under the CGL policy? You know, we talked about bodily injury, property damage, personal injury, advertising injury, etc. So when we talk about bodily injury, that's pretty obvious. It's someone is physically injured, and it's a situation where our negligence has caused somebody to have bodily injury. Pretty simple. Under the property damage section, someone suffers property damage. And I'm going to give you examples of each of these here in just a minute. And then under the personal injury section, someone's damaged by our negligence, and that could be either through libel, slander, false arrest, invasion of privacy. These are some things that we don't typically get into, but someone who's in like the, somebody who's in the landlord business, false arrest and invasion of privacy, those are big deals, and they're covered under the CGL policy. So definitely personal injury is important. In our world, probably not as important as the bodily injury and the property damage. Then there's the advertising injury, which typically is injury caused by false advertising or infringement on someone's copyright or trademark. Pretty self-explanatory there. And then lastly, the medical payments. I call them good faith payments because you don't have to be negligent. They're typically for medical expenses caused by an accident on your premises or because of your operation. Just a little something I tell people, you got $1 million liability coverage and you got $5,000 medical payments coverage. Somebody gets hurt on your property, the insurance company would rather pay $5,000 to have them stitched up, so maybe they won't sue for the $1 million. And so that's what it's all about. It's about mitigating larger claims. It's a good faith payment. There doesn't have to be any kind of negligence. Fall down, break their leg walking to and from, and it would still pay. But that's kind of what medical payments is, and it's kind of odd that it's in there, but it's been in there for many, many years. So now let's talk about an actual claims example so you have a better idea of how a bodily injury type of situation would occur. So I've seen this claim several times. General contractor is using gas-powered generators at a job site, and it's a building renovation, and so part of the building is actually occupied. So the contractor fails to properly vent or contain the emissions from the equipment, and employees working in a nearby area of the building complained of headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems. As a result, air quality studies concluded that the increased carbon dioxide levels in the building resulted from the construction equipment, and the contractor was found liable for causing building-related illnesses, and it resulted in 30 bodily injury claims totaling over $100,000. Very simple example. Those kinds of things do happen. Another one just that I see a lot and I hear about a lot are construction site type bodily injury claims where the homeowner or a guest of the homeowner or maybe just a nosy neighbor comes on the site and uninvited, but there's you have to be reasonable care there, and they get hurt. They fall because maybe there's temporary steps going into the basement, or there's temporary railings out on the deck that were not secured properly, and the doors weren't bolted shut, so they couldn't get out there, or something like that. So your job sites are hazardous places, and you can do all the signs you want to about no trespassing, but we all know what happens. People are curious, owners want to go see the site. So there's holes in the ground, there's all kinds of things that can happen. And so that's where your general liability bodily injury policies tend to see a lot of claims. For property damage claims under the general liability, I'll tell you of an example that I've had several times in my career. And grading contractors, they're supposed to locate the lines, right? So they call and locate the lines. Well, it sometimes it still happens, and sometimes the contractor doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So I've had several claims where, pretty simple, they're digging on a site and they dig up a Bell South or Duke Power or a gas line. So if that happens, obviously there could be loss of revenue to the utility company that owned the line, and all of those things go under that property damage claim. So the monetary loss, as well as the cost of repairing and replacing the gas line or the phone line, all of that goes into that property damage claim. And so that's the concept of the property damage, and it does happen quite often on job sites. An example of a personal injury claim, probably the easiest one, is the owner of XYZ construction company is not getting along with the owner of another construction company, and makes a lot of comments about his quality of work and really throws him under the bus. And so the other contractor finds out about it. It ends up causing them some business. Maybe somebody was going to hire him to build a house until this other contractor badmouthed him and told him what a bad person he was and slandered his name. And so lawsuits come from those things, and that is covered under the CGL policy under the personal injury coverage. And then we get into the advertising injury, which, quite frankly, it's there because someone could steal an idea, do some false advertising, infringe on somebody's copyrights, trademarks, that type of thing. We don't see that a lot in the construction trade, but it could happen. You could have a slogan in a television commercial about your construction company, and some big construction company has something similar, and they decide they're going to shut you down because they don't like the fact that your advertisement is similar to their advertisement. So if they sued you, that's where that coverage would come from. And I just want to make one additional point. We talk about these bodily injury, property damage claims, personal injury, etc., and those are buckets of money. They're there to pay these claims. But there's also something there that is equally as important, and that is the defense of those claims. So there are situations where you didn't do anything wrong and a lawsuit still gets brought. The policy is designed to defend you from these lawsuits. If the insurance company finds that there could be coverage under the policy, and that's a very ambiguous gray area, but if they believe that there could be coverage, then they are required to provide you a defense for that suit. That's very important to understand. Now, if it's cut and dry and they're suing you for something that just is not going to be covered, then they will deny your claim and not pay. And I don't want to get in the weeds, but just to understand, defense cost is included in the CGL policy, and it's a big deal because defense costs in most cases in the good policies it's outside of the limit. So if you had a $1 million limit and you had a $500,000 defense cost, it would pay the $1 million in damages plus the $1 million in defense cost. That's the kind of policy that you want. You want it to be outside of the limit on those policies. So now we're going to talk about what is excluded, the dreaded exclusions in the insurance policy. I talked earlier about general liability being kind of the spoke or the hub, and then their spokes. And what I meant by that is, as I go through exclusions and talk about that, I think it'll start to make a lot of sense to you why the exclusions are in there. One of the things that is excluded specifically in the commercial general liability CGL policy is workers' compensation. Injuries to a worker or employee is specifically excluded under the general liability. Why is that? Because there's a workers' compensation policy that deals with that. Auto is excluded under the general liability policy. Same premise, because it should be protected and covered under the auto liability policy. Watercraft, aircraft, there's two more. If you own a boat or an airplane, you're not going to have coverage under the general liability policy. You're going to have coverage under specific policies for those aircraft and watercraft. Next on the list is pollution. Now, pollution, because of the nature of pollution, whoever invented insurance and came up with all this stuff felt like pollution needed to be its own type of insurance. And it's pretty technical when you get into pollution. So the CGL policy, the standard CGL policy, gives very little pollution coverage, and in some cases excludes it altogether. So for our example, we're going to say it's excluded, okay? If you have pollution needs, you need to buy a pollution policy. That gets in the weeds, and we could talk a lot about pollution, and I do believe contractors have a substantial pollution exposure, especially certain types of contractors, but that is a discussion for another session. Employer's liability. Let me explain. Employer's liability is going to have more to do with lawsuits surrounding, and I'll talk more about this later, third-party claims that have to do with workers being injured, okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about that at a later part of this. Mobile equipment claims, liability claims involving mobile equipment are excluded. Or damage to property that is owned, rented, or in your care, custody, and control is also excluded. Now, let me explain that. If you rent an office or you own a building, and let me give you, this is the best example I can give you. So there's a strip center, strip mall, and you rent the middle unit in a strip center that has 6 other units, or 6 total units, and you burn down the entire place. Policy is not going to pay, it's going to pay for everything except for the part that you were occupying, the parts you rented. The policy excludes any property that is in your care, your custody, and your control. Now, don't be freaked out by that, because the policy also gives that coverage back, and I'll show you that when we get into the next section. A little bit confusing, I know. We'll untangle it. And then lastly, damage to your work. Now, this exclusion for damage to your work, it's probably the most technical and difficult one, but it is very, very prevalent in your industry as general contractors. It can really cause you a lot of problems, and so we want to try to explain it so that you understand what it is. So what I want to do is take you through a scenario where a general contractor is going to build a house, a residential house, let's say. Now, back in the day, many, many years ago, general contractors self-performed most of the work. So they would have employees, and the employees would do electrical, grading, carpentry, plumbing, everything. Well, in the last 25, 30 years, we've gotten away from that. And I think all of you would agree that we don't self-perform anything anymore. General contractors typically sub out everything, hopefully to fully insured, well-insured subcontractors. Now, this house that you're building, you've built the house or in the process of building the house, and the plumber makes a mistake and does not put a fitting on properly, or a well does not hold, something happens, and there is a large water leak in the house. And that water leak has now damaged all of the hardwood floors in the entire house, and there happens to be $50,000 worth of hardwood floors. So the proper way for this to go down is the plumber's insurance would pay that claim under his property damage coverage because he was negligent. Now there's resulting damage to the house, and everybody, it works out, everybody's happy. Now, let's say that the plumber didn't have insurance. You hired him, you thought he had insurance, turns out he doesn't have insurance. In the standard CGL policy, the policy we've all had for many years, and this would be an unendorsed policy, there is an exclusion for property damage to property, but damage to your work, but that exclusion applies to your employees. Okay, so it was meant to, if your employee is the one that screwed up and caused the damage, there would be no coverage under damage to your work. And so as long as you have the standard form and there's no exclusion that's been added, no endorsement that's been added by the insurance company, then you probably have coverage for that subcontractor who has no coverage for that claim. But what I want you to understand is the majority of the companies that write this type of coverage for general contractors, the CGL policy, have added an endorsement called a CG 2294. And that endorsement basically says that there's no coverage to your work if the damage was caused by a subcontractor. So you need to understand that. You need to know it's in there. There are policies out there that do not put that endorsement on. And so I would encourage you to talk to your agent about it, try to find a way to get coverage where there is no endorsement taking that coverage away, because that's where the damage comes from. It typically comes from that uninsured sub, and you just don't know if they paid their bill or whatever. But if we're lucky, they have coverage and it's all okay. But in many cases, we've seen the general liability policy will deny that claim every time if that's on there. In addition to denying that claim, let's say there's a lawsuit that follows. Well, if that endorsement's on there, then the insurance company is going to deny your defense cost as well, because they're going to say, well, there's no coverage because of this endorsement, so we're not even going to defend you in the suit, and you will get named in the lawsuit. So a lot of reasons to make sure that you try to get that endorsement removed. So kind of to sum up the exclusions, there's a lot of exclusions in the policy. There are some additional ones. I just picked out the ones that I felt like were the most important to contractors. Remember, the CGL policy is not just for contractors. Every viable business in the world, at least in our country, typically buy a CGL policy, and they are all very similar, and they all have a lot of the same exclusions. The ones that I picked out here are the ones that we typically see that relate more to general contractors. In this section, we're going to talk about some of the coverage limits. So, we have the policies, and they have all the coverages, etc. But understanding the limits and how the limits work is also important. And so under the CGL policy, you will have bodily injury and property damage, and you will have to pick an occurrence limit. So quite plainly put, you had a claim, and the claim was for $800,000. You would hope you would have at least $800,000 coverage. So what I see most in the industry under the CGL policy, most contractors will choose a $1 million occurrence limit. And so an occurrence limit means that the insurance company, if there is coverage, they would pay up to $1 million per occurrence if that is the limit you chose. In addition to the occurrence limit, they will offer an aggregate limit. And so the aggregate limit in this example would be $2 million. It's typically 2 times the occurrence limit. Now, let me explain. You all understand what an occurrence is. An occurrence is something that occurs one time. But what if you had 2 different claims in 1 year, which would be 2 different occurrences? That's the reason they put the aggregate in. So when you see an aggregate of $2 million, they would pay up to $2 million during the year for multiple occurrences. And so you could literally have two claims for $1 million during the same policy period or the same year. So that's what the aggregate means. In addition to the bodily injury and property damage, you're going to see that policies will have personal injury and advertising, and normally that occurrence limit is identical to the bodily injury and property damage. It is an additional limit of $1 million. Same thing with the aggregate. It's typically 2 times. Now, I will say, I do see some companies offering aggregates larger than double the occurrence. I've seen aggregates as high as $6 million on a $1 million occurrence. Very unusual, but I have seen it. $1 million, $2 million is what you're going to see the most. Then you're going to have medical payments, and you can choose your limit there. Most of the policies come with a $5,000 limit. Again, these are going to be very small. Remember, I talked to you earlier about that being a good faith type payment. You don't have to be negligent. And then damage to rented premises. Now, I'm going to take you back to the prior segment. We talked about damage to property being excluded, damage to property you held in your care, custody, and control. Remember the office building where you occupied the strip center, you occupied the center of it, and there was a claim and there was no coverage for the part you rented, but the rest of it would be covered if you burned it down. This is the give back. This is where you pick up that coverage. Don't ask me why they do it this way, but this is how they do it. So an example of a claim would be you rent the top floor of a large skyscraper, and that building is $200 million, and you cause a fire, and it burns the entire building down. Well, if you had enough coverage, obviously you probably would not, it would pay for everything but the top floor. My reason for bringing this up is you need to make sure that you've got enough limit there for whatever space you're in. So if you were on that top floor, you might have a $10 million exposure, but the policy only comes with $50,000, so obviously you would need to ask for more coverage there. Kind of a crazy example, but you get the point. That is damage to rented premises, same thing as damage to property owned, rented, or in the care, custody, and control of the insured. So make sure you have enough limit if you are renting property from a landlord. And those are basically the coverages and limits that we see the most. Your agent should help you to pick those out. And we'll talk more about excess coverage for liability later when we get into the umbrella section. But those are the underlying typical CGL policy limits. We're going to talk a little bit about risk transfer and how contractors, primarily general contractors, need to understand what risk transfer is. They need to understand how to use it, and they need to understand why. And so this has become an incredibly large part of the construction industry. If you're a general contractor, you probably do not experience this nearly as much as your subcontractors. If you're a subcontractor in the commercial or residential world, you are being inundated with risk transfer requests from larger general contractors. And that's where it all kind of started. The attorneys figured out that there was way too much burden on a general contractor to fight these lawsuits for things that the general contractor really should not be having to do. If I hire a plumber and he goes out and he plumbs my house and he screws it up, why should I be the one as the general contractor to have to deal with that? Why should I have to pay for the damage? So what is risk transfer? Risk transfer is the transfer of liability risk from the general contractor to the subcontractor or the responsible entity. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. There are contractual ways for you as a general contractor to protect yourself, protect your company, and to transfer the risk back to where it should be, and that's the responsible party. So if you hire me as an electrician, I have committed to you that I'm a professional, I'm licensed, I'm insured, and that I'm capable of doing the job and that I will do it in a professional manner, quality, the whole deal. So, why then, when the house burns down because I miswired or did not wire something properly, why is the general contractor the one who should suffer the consequences? It should go back to the electrician if they are the responsible party. Unfortunately, some of the, in our legal society, the general contractor gets drug into these things, and in a lot of cases, they end up having to pay for them. And so, risk transfer is gonna be a big deal. It's going to continue to be important, and the sooner that each general contractor learns it, understands it, and embraces it, the better off everybody's going to be, especially the general contractors. Now, in the last section, I talked extensively about the endorsement that plagues general contractors for damage to their work by their subcontractors. Subcontractor does something wrong and it causes damage to the house, and those endorsements are out there all over the place. Well, this is where we can mitigate a lot of that. So, in this particular section, what we want to talk about is how do we transfer the risk from the general contractor to the subcontractor? We do that through a well-written legal contract between the general contractor and the subcontractor. Now, these contracts, they need to be written or at least reviewed by legal counsel. Sometimes you can find these on the internet, but I strongly encourage you to have your legal counsel review those, and if not, write it for you. There are several parts to it, so it should contain a hold harmless agreement and an indemnification clause. It should require the subcontractor to carry adequate types and limits of insurance. You specify what those limits and types of insurance are, and your agent should be able to help you with that. The contract should also require subcontractor to add the general contractor as additional insured for ongoing and completed operations. I'm going to repeat that. It's incredibly important. Subcontractor should be required in the contract to add the general contractor as additional insured for ongoing, which is while he's on the job site doing the work, and completed operations. So I'm going to stop there for just a second. All of you have been in the business any time at all. You know what a certificate of insurance is. You see them all the time. Nothing new there. What's new there is most GCs will get the certificate from the sub, and it won't have anything in there about being an additional insured. It may or may not have the right limits on it. But let me tell you, what if you're getting the additional insured coverage for yourself, which I'm going to explain what that is, you got to make sure it's ongoing and completed operations. The standard additional insured endorsement just says ongoing. It's just for while he's on the job site. Well, think about it. When does the plumbing break? The pipe bursts 2 or 3 months later after the homeowners moved in. It almost never happens until after you've closed the house and somebody's moved in. So that is a completed operation, and you have to have the right coverage on that additional insured endorsement in order to be protected there. Okay, so subcontractor is also going to be required to provide a certificate of insurance prior to beginning work for the general contractor. Pretty easy, but we definitely need to make sure that you've got the contract, and it's got all the different things that I talked about, the hold harmless indemnification, and in the right limits of coverage, whether it's $1 million, $2 million, whatever you want them to have. I highly recommend they have the general liability, the workers' comp. Those are the key ones. Some GCs require the auto. Your subcontractor could drive his truck right through the house. Don't you want to make sure there's coverage under his auto policy for that? So that risk transfer written contract between you and that sub is critical. Now, I work with a lot of general contractors, and I get a lot of pushback, especially in the residential world. Residential contractor uses the same framer for every house, for the most part. Uses the same drywall guy, same painter. He says to me, well, I can't make him sign a contract on every job. Because if you'll note, if you go on the Google and Google these types of contracts, most of them are job specific. So what I would tell you is, if you're doing it that way, now commercial's different. Commercial, they're all job specific, and that's how they should be. But when you get into these residential, most residential builders do not do job specific contracts with their subs. I have seen, and I think it's a great idea, but you will have to talk to your attorney, your legal counsel about it. I have seen builders use what's called it's a service contract or an ongoing, annually renewed type of contract for all the work that they do for you. It does not necessarily say it's for a specific project, but it has a time frame. So typically 12 months, and it does exactly the same thing, but it says any of the work they do for you, and during that 12 months they have to have these coverages. This is the contract. This applies to all the projects that they do for you in North Carolina during this time frame. Now, again, I'm no attorney. You need to get your attorney to help you with that, but I have seen a couple of very reputable builders have some success with that, and they do it a little bit different. It's not a contract per project. It's an ongoing service type contract. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about additional insured and making sure you were additional insured under the contract and on the certificate of insurance. So let me just drop back a minute. I want to explain what this actually is. So if you're a general contractor and I'm doing work for you as your subcontractor, you can ask me to add you to my policy as an additional insured. Now, what that does is it gives me, the general contractor, let's say, it gives the general contractor coverage under the subcontractor's policy. So for example, the example I gave where the plumber did the plumbing and the plumber actually did something wrong, it caused the big leak, $50,000 damage. Now we have a lawsuit from the homeowner, and it's against the plumber, and it's also against the general contractor. So if I'm the general contractor and I have additional insured status on your policy, Mr. Plumber, when I receive my copy of the lawsuit, all I have to do is hand that to the insurance company, and I know who that is because I have your certificate of insurance that says you're insured with XYZ Insurance Company. It also gives me the policy number and the dates of coverage. So I'm going to call, we'll just use whatever, the Hartford, and I'm going to say, hey, I've been sued. Here's a copy of the complaint. I have an additional insured status under Joe's Electrical Company's policy that you write, Mr. Hartford, and I would like for you to, I'm tendering my lawsuit to you for coverage under his policy. That is risk transfer works. If it's done correctly, the Hartford will then include you in their defense. You will not have to access your own insurance company and risk possibly losing your insurance because of claims frequency or whatever. And it is just a very, very good practice to get into. You need to do it on every single subcontractor. You need to make sure that you're additional insured. Now, on that additional insured, it's in the form typically of an endorsement. An endorsement is just something they add on to the policy. And what I would recommend you do is you probably need to get a copy of that endorsement so that you can know for sure that it says for ongoing work and completed operations. Your agent, if they have experience in the commercial insurance world, will know exactly what you're talking about. They'll understand when you talk, which endorsements you need, and they'll be able to guide you through that. Again, very important that you work with an experienced construction insurance agent. Lastly, in the CGL section, we're going to talk a little bit about audits, and we're going to touch a little more on the classifications. You need to understand that when you first take these policies out, they're going to have the premium's going to be based on certain exposures. And when that agent starts to write that policy for you, he's going to ask you what's your payroll and what are your total cost for subcontractors. So the payroll is pretty easy. If you've got one executive supervisor, you're going to tell him that, and that's going to be, maybe that's the only person you have on W-2 as an employee. You may have some clerical and sales, but they do not get counted in the premium calculation for CGL, okay? Sales and clerical are excluded, and typically that's because they don't really pose a big exposure to the general liability, whereas your field people, like your executive supervisor who's out there, doing project supervision, as well as your carpenters, if you have those on payroll, all of those are much, that's what they're going to base the premium on for in payroll. The second thing they're going to ask you for is, all right, tell me the subcontractors. Tell me your total cost of subcontractors for the next 12 months. That's a difficult question, and you have to ballpark that. This is an estimate. Payroll's an estimate, and your subcontracted cost is an estimate. Those are the two things that are primarily going to drive the premium on the CGL policies. If you're going to build 5 houses, and those 5 houses are going to be $200,000 a piece, you're going to basically be about $1 million in subcontracted cost. Because you subcontract everything out, most of you do, and so it is material and labor typically. There are a few companies that may allow you to use just labor, and I know it sounds unusual because it's subcontracted cost should be labor only, but the way it's defined, it is supposed to include material and labor, especially if the sub is doing turnkey and providing the material. You could probably make the argument, and I don't want to get in the weeds on this, that if the general contractor is purchasing the lumber and paying that framer separately, then I would argue you could probably use the subcontractor's labor only. But again, that's a company specific, and I'm not going to get in the middle of that discussion today. But just remember, payroll for field operations type people, executive supervisors, carpenters, that's what they're going to look at that. So they need that payroll for 12 months, and then they also need the total cost of subcontracted work. And that is total cost in most cases defined as labor and materials. Okay, so that's how they're going to determine what your premium is. And that leads us into the audit. At the end of the year, because you gave them an estimate, they don't know and you don't know whether you owe them money or they owe you money. So they're going to do an audit. Be aware of it at the end of the year, at the end of the period, whenever your policy runs out, about 30 days after that, you're going to get a call or a letter that says we need to perform the audit. Don't get mad. You're not being selected against. It's very typical. It is required. It's in the contract that they have the right to review your books. You sign that contract when you buy that policy. You agree to provide them with all the financial data they ask for these audits. Most of the time they do a physical audit. They will come out and they will sit down and they want and here are the things that they want to see. They want to see 1099s for all subcontractors for that 12-month period. They're also going to ask for a certificate of insurance proving that those subcontractors had general liability of their own during that 12-month period that they worked for you, or during the time they worked for you. So be aware, you better be getting these certificates of insurance from these subcontractors, because if not, everything you pay them is going to go in as payroll, and it's going to be a lot more expensive. Premium for these subcontractors, if they're fully insured subcontractors and have their own CGL, is dirt cheap compared to putting them on as putting it into the payroll. So it's just one of those things you learn as you've been in the business a while to be very diligent, get the certificates, make sure the dates match, Make sure the name on the certificate is the same as the name that you wrote the check to when you paid them. Very important. You're going to go through the audit. If you told them that you had payroll of X and subcontract cost of X and you come in less for the year, they're going to owe you money. They're going to send you a check. If it's the other way around, you're going to send them a check. And please understand, they're serious about these audits and they will hunt you down for this money. So it's a big deal. I, again, go back to having an experienced agent who can educate you and help you understand that process in the front, and also help walk you through in the back end if you have issues and go to bat for you, because there are some cases where the companies are wrong and you have to go back and you have to fight with them a little bit. It's a difficult part of the process, but it doesn't have to be if you're prepared and you do a lot on the front end, get your certificates, etc. Workers' compensation. I'm sure most of you understand or know what workers' compensation is, and you probably know it mainly because it costs so much money. In our industry, in the commercial industry for construction, we've got some of the highest rates out there. So workers' comp can be a tough pill to swallow if you're a business owner in the construction industry. What we want to do today is talk a little bit about workers' comp, talk about what and who workers' comp is intended to cover. We're going to talk also about who's required to buy workers' comp. A lot of misunderstandings about that. We're going to talk about what are the coverages within the policy. And then we're going to talk about how W-2 employees are covered under workers' comp, and we're going to also talk about subcontractors or 1099 folks and how they may or may not be covered under workers' comp. And lastly, we're going to talk about how the premiums are determined, what the classifications and how those work, and then we're going to talk about owners and officers' coverage within the workers' comp policy. Lastly, we will also cover the audit part of workers' compensation, similar to what we did in the CGL policy, but I do think it's worth touching on how these policies get audited and some of the pitfalls that you need to be aware of. Who workers' compensation is intended to cover and what it covers. In North Carolina, workers' compensation is intended to provide coverage to employees for work-related injuries or illness. In order to be covered, the injury or illness must have, and this is important, arose out of their employment and occurred within the course of their employment. Now, we want to break that down a little bit further and talk a little bit about maybe some examples. But first, whenever there's a claim in workers' compensation, one of the first things that the adjuster is going to do to look and see if a claim is compensable, that's a word they use when they're trying to decide to pay the claim, they're going to say, okay, first, in the course of, did it occur during a period of time in which the employee was working? So was he on the job? Was he actually at work? Then they're going to, if that passes muster, they'll move to the second part, which is arose out of. Did the accident occur as a result of a certain employment activity the employee was hired to do? So if I'm an employee and I am on the job site, that would take care of the first, in the course of. So I'm actually on the job site. It is working hours. And then we go to arose out of. Well, I'm a framer. I'm framing a roof on a house. I'm putting rafters up, whatever. And I actually fall while I'm up there framing the roof. So my injury occurred and arose out of my doing the activity that I get paid to do or was hired to do, which is framing. So it occurred during a time period in which I was working on the job site, and it arose out of me swinging a hammer while I was framing. That would be a compensable type of claim. Now let's take an example of a claim that would not be compensable. And it could be something as simple as you're at work and you clock out and you're on your way home, or you're on your way to lunch. So you have a car accident after you've clocked out and left the office or the work site. And so right there in the very first, in the course of, did it occur during a period of time in which the employee was working? No. The employee had clocked out, left the job site, and was on their way home. That immediately would make that a non-compensable accident. Now, if the boss said to the lady that works in the office, "Hey, I need you to go to the bank and make the deposit on your lunch hour." So in that scenario, is it in the course of, or did it occur in a period of time in which the employee was working? Well, there's some gray areas sometimes, but if she was required to go to the bank by her boss, the argument would be that yes, that was during a time period in which the employee was working. She was still working because she was asked to go to the bank as part of her job, and it arose out of her being asked to go to the bank, which is part of what she was asked to do as part of her employment. So in that case, I believe they would pay a claim, and they do pay claims in those situations. So it really, every claim is different. I had someone had a spider bite, for example, and it was deemed that that was a non-compensable claim because that employee, yes, they were on the job site working at the time they were bit by the spider, but they said it did not arise out of the employment activity because the employee was not actually doing anything at the time that was part of their employment. They were actually at the nursing home they worked at, but the spider bite had nothing to do with activity that they would be doing working as a nurse in a nursing home. Now, had another one where a construction worker did get bit by a spider, and they paid that one. He was on the job site working and picked up some boards, and there was a black widow spider or brown recluse, I don't remember, and that one actually did get covered by workers' compensation. So it's kind of a fine line sometimes, but if you remember in the course of and arose out of, I think that will help you, and then ultimately the claims department will make those final decisions. But one of the things I want to make sure that I get across to you is it's an important coverage, and we need to make sure that we are protecting our workers. And I feel like that as a employer, we have not only a legal responsibility but a moral responsibility. The last thing as a business owner you want to do is have to face the family, the wife and kids of an employee who was injured or killed on your job site, and then on top of that, that they don't have any insurance, and so that family has no way to recover any income that person brings home every day. Very important coverage. So who is required to buy coverage? This is I don't know, a lot of people don't really understand who is required and who's not required. You hear a lot of people talk about this. Oh, I'm not really required. I'm a sole proprietor, or I don't have any employees. Why should I buy it, etc. But I'm gonna go over with you who is actually required to buy coverage. So in North Carolina, there's a statute, and statutes are laws, and it's Article 197-2 under the Workers' Compensation Act. And it says that any business that employ 3 or more employees is required to provide workers' compensation coverage. So I've heard it stated when you go over 2, the act actually says when you employ 3 or more, you are required to provide workers' compensation. So very important. We are one of only a handful of states left in the country who do not require it on every employee regardless of the size of the company. Most states do not have this exclusion for under 3 employees. We are one that still has it. There's been lots of talk over the years about doing away with that. I personally think that would be a good thing. It would make things simpler. Sole proprietors, members of LLCs, and partners are not automatically covered as employees and do not have to be included. Now, the reason this is important, if I've got a business and I'm an LLC and I have 2 employees, then technically by statute I'm not legally required to carry workers' compensation because I only have 2 employees. And I, as a LLC member, I'm not covered under that workers' comp unless I decide that I want to be. Now, I can elect to have coverage, and if I do elect to be covered, that's fine. But for the purposes of deciding if I'm in compliance with the statute, I do not get counted myself as the owner If I'm an LLC, sole proprietor, or a partner, those do not get counted in that 3 or more employee count. Conversely, if I'm a S Corp or C Corp, all officers are automatically covered unless they choose not to be, and they are included in the count. And so the point is, if I'm a C Corp or S Corp and I have 2 employees, then guess what? I really have 3 because I'm also an employee. And so therefore, by statute, I'm required to carry the coverage. Don't get that confused with I'm not required to cover myself, but I do count in the employee count. And so in that situation, I would have to buy it. Know that this is a serious thing with the state of North Carolina. For many years, they did not enforce it. They didn't have a way to enforce it. But I will tell you that has changed. It is now being enforced. The Industrial Commission is working in conjunction with the North Carolina Department of Insurance and the Rate Bureau. They know when someone has a workers' comp policy and that policy cancels, that automatically, that information goes to the Industrial Commission, and they have investigators. And I know this firsthand because I have had many clients tell me in the last 2 or 3 years that they got a visit from an investigator who knocked on their door and demanded that they produce a workers' compensation policy. They said that they showed where their policy canceled on this date, and they wanted to see a copy of the new one that replaced it. In almost all of those cases, the client had let their policy cancel for non-payment or decided they didn't want to carry it anymore to pay the bill because it is expensive. I had one guy who was not my client who we talked one day, and he was an electrician, and he had 5 or 6 employees. He got fined $26,000 because he went for almost a year without coverage. And so he had to go to court. He had to fight that. I do not know what that outcome was, but he did get fined $26,000, and my guess is he ended up paying something. The point there is, if you have to buy it, you need to be very careful that you keep it in force because it is a statutory requirement, and they are watching it very closely. The last thing I'm going to say about the who's required to buy it, etc., is even if you are a small employer and you only had 2 employees and you're an LLC, or you have 1 employee, I said earlier, I feel like you have a moral responsibility to your employees. So I want you to understand that just because the law says you don't have to carry it, that there's not a statutory requirement that so you're under the threshold and you're not statutorily required to carry it, that does not mean that you could not be held responsible for that injured employee. And I think people get caught up in thinking, well, I'm not required, there's nothing can happen. But that doesn't mean that employee's family couldn't sue you or that employee couldn't sue you. So, my best advice would be if you have an employee, you need to carry workers' compensation. And that's pretty much cut and dry. What are the coverages within the policy for workers' compensation? So in North Carolina, all the coverages you see in that policy for work comp are mandated by statute. So in other words, every policy is going to be the same regardless of which company writes that policy. There's actually 2 different coverages you're going to find within what we call a workers' compensation policy. Most people don't know this, but there are 2 things in there. There's the workers' compensation and there's employer's liability. Now, we've already covered workers' compensation, and you understand that that is for medical expenses to treat injured employees or illnesses that an employee has gotten on the job and in the course of and arose out of their job. It also covers their missed wages. It also covers rehabilitation and has a small death benefit coverage. So workers' compensation is one part of the policy. The other part of the policy is the employer's liability. Now, that is typically a coverage that would be for a third party that suffered a financial loss because of an injury to an employee. So, for example, a wife sues a business because she now has to stay home and care for her husband who was injured on the job. She has a claim. She's not the one injured, but she has been suffered a financial loss due to the injury of an employee. She's a third party, and she has a right to sue the insurance company under employer liability. Another example would be if a lawsuit against an employer by an employee because the employee told the employer of a hazardous condition and the employer didn't do anything to fix it, and that led to the employee's injury. So that would be the other situation where maybe there was gross negligence on the part of the employer, and it was so gross that the workers' comp is not sufficient. The employee could go back because of a dangerous condition that the employer knew about and could sue them under employer liability. Now, let me say this. One of the things people miss all the time is workers' compensation. There's no limit to the benefit. So whatever it costs to pay that employee till he's 65, lost wages, he can never work again, or maybe he's got asbestos. That was a big deal back in the day, and the treatments for that or the cancer or whatever that was caused by that asbestos might have been $2 million. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's $10 million. The policy has no limit on that benefit. The employer liability, where the wife sued, that does have a limit, and typically it's $100,000 per occurrence. Could be up to $500,000 aggregate on that. So it does have an actual limit. Also with this, if you remember back in the CGL policy, we talked about the exclusions, and one of those exclusions was employees. Injury to employees is excluded under the CGL, but that's where the workers' compensation would come in and pay that, and that's the reason that it's not covered under the CGL, because we have workers' comp to do that. And then that employer liability is also excluded in the CGL, and that's why they picked that up also in the workers' comp policy for those third-party lawsuits from wives or employee who's had an injury due to a hazardous condition. So you can see how these policies are starting to work together, where one will have an exclusion. The reason for the exclusion is to pick up that coverage under another policy where it's more appropriate. Subcontractors, 1099 versus W-2. Hey, I know that in our world, general contractors, a lot of them are out there with people working for them, and they're 1099 in those people, and they may actually be employees. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but we're also going to talk about subcontractors, true subcontractors. I like to refer to subcontractors as either an insured subcontractor or an uninsured subcontractor. Number one, they should all be insured, and they should all be required to carry workers' compensation and general liability. That should not be something that you're willing to be flexible on in most cases. Now, we all know that sometimes you got to make a business decision. You got a pile of rocks that need to be moved, and you don't have anybody to do it. You're going to hire somebody to do it. Or you've got somebody who's good. He's a great trim carpenter, but he's a one-man show, and he just doesn't have coverage, and you're in a pickle, and you need the guy to do the work. Hey, we've all been there. But I'm telling you, they all need to have workers' comp, and they all need to have general liability. However, sometimes you make a business decision, and that, again, that's a business risk that you take. Just know that if you do hire that person and they do not have insurance, you will be charged whatever you pay them, materials and labor, whatever the check is, will be counted as payroll, just like they were an employee, and it gets very, very expensive. That's the word of caution, is if you choose to do it, just know that you're going to pay it at audit time, and you're going to pay the premium on it. And if that person happens to be doing framing, it's a big number. It could be a 15% of what you paid them for the insurance premium. Understand that in North Carolina, if you are a general contractor and you hire a subcontractor, you could be held liable for the injuries to that uninsured subcontractor. If he doesn't have his own coverage and he's got employees, you are technically on the hook for those employees of his if they are injured on your job site. Now, the way I understand the statute, and I am not a lawyer, but the sub himself, the owner of that company, you may not be responsible for, but if he has a helper or employees and they're on your job site and get hurt, you would be held responsible for them or could be held responsible for them. Like I said, some contractors, they like to use 1099 labor to save the cost of additional taxes and insurance. I will warn you to be very careful about that. The Industrial Commission may rule them as an employee. So something could happen and there could be a claim, and if they come back and determine that, you know what, you were just trying to get around the system by not paying the matching taxes on them and buying the insurance, the Industrial Commission could come in and say, hey, they're employees, not to mention IRS could do the same thing to you, and that could be devastating. Lastly, I'll say that some insurance companies just will not write policies for businesses that use uninsured subcontractors. So you need to be careful about that. There are a few who will, but many of them will say, hey, if they're using subcontractors that don't have proper coverage themselves, we're not going to insure them as uninsured subcontractors. The last section here is premium classification, owners and officers. So just be aware that workers' comp policies are based on an annual basis. They're 12-month policies. The premium that you pay is going to be based on payroll. That's it. It's always based on payroll. You are going to keep track of payroll per employee, and they will be classified with a code. They may be a carpenter, they may be an electrician, they may be a concrete person, they could be an executive supervisor. There are numerous different codes, and just so you know, unlike general liability, none of those are excluded. So sales and clerical are not excluded. If you have sales and clerical, they have a code for that. Clerical people pay a much lower rate than your framers, which would be under carpentry. Classifications, your agent will help you with that, and you've probably done some of that before and understand it. Again, we talked a little owners and officers. They have to elect coverage. If they are a corporation, they're automatically covered. If they are an LLC, then they are not automatically covered. They have to choose that, okay? And then they will be given a classification as well, depending on what their duties are. Some of you may be familiar with a term EMR rating or your experience mod. In workers' compensation, when you reach over $5,000 worth of premium, insurance companies are required to report your payroll and your claims payments to the Rate Bureau of North Carolina. Those two things go together, and the Rate Bureau will come up with a calculation and give you an experience mod. Now, that experience mod will either debit or credit the premium that you pay. If you've had good experience and no claims, you're going to pay less than someone who's had claims or bad experience. Just be aware, you have to have 3 years in business, the 3 years of payroll and claims dollars that are paid out. All that goes in for 3 years. They come up with an EMR factor, and then that will be used in the premium calculation by your insurance company. Very important that you keep those claims to a minimum, because it will affect you adversely, very adversely in some cases, if your EMR gets too high. Just like in the general liability, also know that workers' comp is going to be an audited policy, and the insurance company is going to take a look at what you did over the last 12 months or during the last 12 months, your policy dates, and they're going to adjust your premium up or down, and they're going to be looking to see if those subcontractors had adequate workers' comp coverage. Please be aware, this is one of those huge costs at the end of your policy period if you have worked people who do not have adequate insurance. Again, talk to your agent. Make sure you fully understand when you buy that policy exactly what you're doing and what your payrolls are. I think it's one of those places. I had a guy had a $120,000 audit one year, and it put him out of business. So not anything to take lightly. Commercial auto insurance. We're not going to spend too much time on this. I just had a couple things I wanted to go over with you. So most contractors drive a truck or have some trucks, have some company vehicles. The commercial auto policy is going to work just like a personal auto policy in most ways. It's very similar. It is typically written on an annual basis, and the limits are normally issued by companies at about $1 million. You can sometimes buy more coverage if you need that, but they usually start at $1 million. You need to understand that if you have employees, and they drive your company vehicles, that is probably one of the largest exposures you can have as a contractor or a business owner. You need to be sure you screen those employees upon hiring to make sure they have good driving records and that you're putting people behind the wheel who are going to make good decisions, because you are putting your company at risk. We also recommend that your corporate vehicles or your company vehicles be titled to the company. That actually helps to do risk transfer and transfer the risk to the entity instead of you personally. It's one thing to lose everything you have as a company. It's quite a different thing to lose all of the personal assets that you've built up over the years. I want to talk to you for just a minute here about commercial umbrella liability. Some people refer to that as excess liability. Just be aware that as your company grows and your assets grow, your need for more coverage under the liability side of your business can be more than just the typical $1 million GL or CGL policy or auto policy. So what happens is we issue a policy. It's usually a separate policy, and it goes, just like it says, umbrella over top of the commercial CGL policy, as well as the auto policy and the employer liability policy. We can start at $1 million and go as high as you need. I've seen $20 million umbrella policies. Just be aware, if you have a contract with somebody or you feel that you have more assets at risk than you have coverage for on your underlying policies, you can always buy an umbrella to add more layers of coverage over top of the general liability, the auto liability, and the employer liability. The last thing we're going to cover today are bonds, and I just want to explain to everybody that bonds are not insurance. When you buy insurance, you're buying a promise from the insurance company to protect you from some type of financial loss. You pay the premium for the policy, and the insurance company pays on your behalf and will not come to you for repayment. So that is, you're transferring your risk through premium payment in a contract to the insurance company. When you buy a bond, you're asking the bonding company to make a financial payment on your behalf if needed. You'll pay a premium for the bond, but when you sign that bond, you're promising to repay that bonding company in full for money that they have to put up for you. So very different. It is not insurance. All they're doing is fronting you the money in the event you default on a contract that required a bond. Types of bonds. There are two main types that I would say you need to be familiar with. There's the license and permit bonds, which most of you probably have had to purchase or will have to purchase. And those are basically for state and municipalities, and all they do is, we pull permits to get inspections on our jobs. Well, if you have an account at the county, and instead of you pulling permits and not paying them, they get upset about that. They now require these bonds. They're called license and permit bonds. And so if you don't pay for your permits or your inspections, they cash in the bond and the insurance company pays them. Those are typically small, $5,000 to $2,000, $10,000, not very big bonds at all. They're very inexpensive. Most of them are about $100 a year. Performance and payment bonds, most commercial general contractors run into this quite often. If you're doing municipal work or you're doing work for a larger type of contract, the owner may require you to carry a performance and payment bonds. And here's how that works. A performance bond is a bond that guarantees the contractor will perform and complete the job per the contract. If you do not, the bonding company can step in on your behalf and help the owner complete that contract. They'll supply the money. The owner will finish the contract with another contractor, and then the bond company will come to you for repayment. The other part of that is the payment bond, and the payment bond guarantees that the contractor will pay all of the suppliers, vendors, and laborers. So when we see a bonded contract or a bonded project for a municipality, for example, they will typically ask for a performance and payment bond. They're technically two different bonds, but they almost always come together. That is what you'll see a lot of times on a commercial job. Do not see those on residential jobs, but on commercial jobs you will see that. One last thing on bonds. The way bonding companies underwrite bonds is based on credit, and so they will typically look at the owner's credit, and you have to have good credit in order to qualify for these bonds. You have to have strong financial statements especially if you are doing larger bonds. Now, small bonds under $500,000 for these payment and performance, you can usually get those if you have a decent credit score. So just be aware, companies want to be repaid if you default on these bonds, and so they're going to make sure you have adequate credit. So we've covered quite a bit of insurance today, and hopefully it's been a good use of your time. Hopefully you've picked up some things about insurance that will help you in the future. I have appreciated your time and your attention today, and I wish you all the best going forward with your careers in the construction industry. If there's ever anything I can do or answer any questions for you, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I certainly would be more than willing to help you in any way that I can.